the topic is negotiating with North Korea, and it's a difficult topic, and a lot of things that Westerners don't understand about dealing with North Korea, I think would be illuminated if they understood some of the things that we know about dealing with South Korea. The South Koreans here present may not appreciate this anecdote, but when I was living in Seoul and working with the Fulbright program there, I had a lot of friends who were affiliated with the AmCham, the American Chamber of Commerce in Seoul. And the foreigners there in Korea had a certain degree of cynicism, or they joke about things in Korea a little bit, and they actually would sponsor a briefing. The AmCham would have a briefing for a new business that would come into Korea. And the new business would come in and want to know what things are like, and what are the rules of the game here, and all these sorts of things. And if the business wanted to, they could pay for a morning breakfast. And at the morning breakfast, they would get a briefing. Well, at the briefing, one of the standard things that the AmCham briefers would say is, Korea is the land of the morning calm and the afternoon chaos. There's everything to try to get finished before the end of the day. Another thing they would say is, Korea is the place where negotiations begin after the contract is signed. Now, as American businessmen would come in, they would shake their heads at that. And what do you mean? How, you negotiate something, then you sign the contract, and it's done. And in the Western world, we have this idea of, well, I don't even need a contract. A man's word is as good as his bond. You shake your hands on something, and the deal is done. And what do you mean the negotiations begin when the contract is signed? It's a joke. It's cynical. But in many, many cases, the Korean supplier, the Korean manufacturer, and his counterpart with the Westerner would very often, after the contract was signed, say, well, conditions have changed. Our supplies are coming in more expensive now, our raw materials, our labor, whatever, and we need to change the contract. And the Westerners would say, oh, the contract's a contract, the deal's a deal. You lose money, that's too bad, tough, don't talk to me about it. And the Korean response is that, well, don't be so cold. We Koreans have a unique thing. It's called chung. And Koreans like to say that no English word exists for chung. We have chung. And if most of you speak Korean out in the audience there, I think, and you can try to translate chung. It's a love or a concern for others or a human feeling. And Koreans like to say that they're the only people in the whole universe that have chung. Well, it's not true. Other people have chung. But they use this chung as a way of saying, well, let's look at this contract. Come on, don't be black and white on the paper. Let's be a human here. I've got some costs. The conditions have changed. Let's renegotiate the contract. And if that's the way it is in dealing with South Koreans, with whom there's a common objective of building widgets and selling them and making money, then how much is that sort of mentality going to be true with dealing with the North Koreans, where there is not as much a clearly defined common goal, you see? So I think, this sounds strange to a lot of people in America, maybe more so to right-wing Republicans, who very often, especially since the Christianization of the Republican Party, that they very often look at things in very black and white moralistic terms. And you cannot renegotiate a deal. Well, let's go back to this agreed framework. We had here a speaker from the State Department a couple of weeks ago who stood up and talked about the six-party talks. And the first thing he did was talk about what a rotten deal the agreed framework was. It was no good from the get-go. It was dead in the water. It shouldn't have been signed. It shouldn't have been done. It was no good. And he represents a certain faction within Washington that comes from this point of view that, it's either a cut and dry deal and you're going to live by your word and it's black and white, or it's not. And if you can't deal with an agreement, why, you're a no good, evil person, country, and we can't deal with you. And there's a certain element within Washington that said the agreed framework was no good. In fact, the agreed framework was not even funded by Congress when Congress had to vote on it. And so it was dead in the water. And yet we turn around with this great high-powered morality of how evil the North Koreans are because they backed out of the agreed framework. And you say, well, the North Koreans said we backed out. Oh, yeah, sure they say that, but we don't back out. Well, we're black and white. We keep our deals. And we make this agreed framework, and we make these promises to North Korea to do these things, and then we turn around and Congress doesn't fund them. Well, that's okay, you see, because, well, we're the good guys after all. And what do you mean, North Korea, that we're bad guys? What do you mean we're not keeping our word? Well, we tried our best. We signed the agreement. Well, if Congress couldn't endorse it, well, that's the best we could do. You see? So it's okay for us to get out of a promise, but it's not okay for the North Koreans to get out of a promise. Now tell me where that's right. And remember, the agreed framework is a unique term. There's never been another treaty. There's never been another agreement. There's never been another nation-to-nation compromise or anything that's been called the agreed framework. As they were looking for something to name this thing, they knew that they were breaking new ground, that they'd never done this before. And so they named it something new. And agreed framework is not black and white contract. It's not treaty. It's not, it's hardly anything if you're going to be critical of it. But it was in the Middle East, they talk about the roadmap. Well, that had been used in the Middle East. That's sort of what the agreed framework was. It was more of a roadmap that if certain things went, along, then things would work out. And the Americans used their freedom within this agreed framework to get out of it. And then we turn around and blame the North Koreans for their weaseling on the agreed framework. By what they did is they started experimenting with uranium, whereas they had given up the plutonium. They said, no, the agreement says plutonium. It doesn't say uranium. You see, so by the same token, they're redefining the thing. And the agreed framework was only as good as the goodwill on both sides to try to make it work. The agreed framework was criticized by a lot of people as being appeasement. Certain sectors in Washington said, oh, it's appeasement. It's bribery. It's succumbing to extortion and all these sorts of things. Well, as Gordon just said, to purchase peace for a time, it gets you peace for a time. And of course the appeasement argument is that it's worse after it falls apart, but maybe it's not. For example, before we attacked Baghdad 3 years ago, if we could have given Saddam Hussein $1 billion, if you were in the White House and you could have negotiated a deal with Saddam Hussein, $1 billion to go to South Africa or Saudi Arabia, or someplace where you're safe, you can spend your money, who would not have taken that deal? Right? I mean, is there anyone here that would say, no, I don't want to pay Saddam Hussein $1 billion to get him out of office. I would rather have 2,000 American boys killed and 16,000 wounded and somewhere between 30 and 100,000 Iraqis killed. I would prefer that to paying $1 billion. Plus, I prefer paying, what's the cost of the war right now? 10 billion?
More than that. Oh, 150 billion.
150 billion. Okay. I mean, so what are the relative costs here? You see? And so for the agreed framework, we were willing to pay for not just peace, but a process toward a better and more lasting peace. And during the time of the agreed framework, there were all sorts of things happening in North Korea, all sorts of loosening things up. And there were all sorts of rumors of a potential coup here and a potential coup there and a disappearing general, and chances for some movement internally within the system. Since the agreed framework has been scuttled, the North Korean regime has become harder and harder, and in a sense, George Bush has become Kim Il-sung's best friend. In an ironic sort of way. And very much in the same way that Park Chung-hee, who was the autocratic ruler in South Korea, as you know, his best friend was Kim Il-sung. Anytime things were rough for Park Chung-hee, student demonstrations were peaking or whatever, oh, look at North Korea. Oh, look at Kim Il-sung. National emergency. Decree number 7. Whatever it was that he needed to crack down. Park Chung-hee's best friend was Kim Il-sung. Kim Jong-il's best friend is George Bush, because it gives him the excuse to back himself and everybody else into that corner and to get by somehow with tightening their belts and starving a certain sector of the population and getting through this crisis. And through the whole thing, the propaganda says that the evil on the other end that's causing all these problems is the United States. You see, so yeah, we got to rally around and support Kim Il-sung, and that's what happens in North Korea. Well, I want to talk about our North Korean negotiating in the context of a friend of mine. The other day I was watching C-SPAN, and they had this program on Korea. It was cool, and there were all these Korean studies scholars and diplomats that I've known, some I've heard of from various contexts. They were all there. It was a panel of about 20 people. Did you see that program? It was a great program. I don't know when the conference was held, but it was on C-SPAN. And they were talking about, it was right after the agreed framework and just after the Bush administration had taken over, and talking about the problems with the agreed framework. Garlucci was there, who negotiated the deal, and he was talking about what he was trying to do. Wendy, what's her name? Sherman was there and talked about her role in the negotiations. Don Oberdorfer was there, talking about the thing from the perspective of a journalist. Do you know Don Oberdorfer? Wrote Two Koreas. Retired journalist from the Washington Journal, Washington Post, excuse me, scholar journalist. He was there, and there was my friend. I refer to him as my friend, Ambassador Don Gregg, and he was talking about how, with the new Bush administration in Washington, things weren't going well. And he used the phrase, "This is really hard." He said that, "This is really hard," in very sort of personal terms. And then he went on and made some criticisms of the way the administration was going. And as I watched him, I thought, this guy is really in agony. And I called him up afterward, and I said, "You said that was really hard, and I see what you were talking about." And what it was he was breaking with the Republican administration on this issue. Now, you got to know who Donald Gregg is. Let's learn who Donald Gregg is. Can you type in quotation mark Don Gregg, 2 G's, and end quotation mark and hit search. And we're going to learn a little bit who Don Gregg is and what he is. Now, click on that very first one. Click on it in HTML. Oh well, it's already going. Yeah, click on it and view in HTML. This first thing. Oh, no, PDF's okay. Here, excuse me, hit on the first one. Yeah, hit on PDF. Will your PDF load? This first thing is really irrelevant, but it's just really, look. Here is a letter on letterhead to from the USA ROK Economic Council addressed to Don Gregg, National Security Staff Director, 1982. This is saying, "Dear Don, I've had a conversation with Vice President Bush." Don Gregg was Vice President Bush's National Security Advisor. And he got into a lot of trouble with him because of the Iran-Contra scandal way back when. We won't go into that. But here they're talking about, toward the bottom there, it says, hey, I got a laser pointer, don't I? Here, watch this thing, watch this. Ah, look at that. It talks about this Governor Yu Guohua, who is from Taiwan, and he says, we need to have a careful, prudent guy here who can talk about our policies being misunderstood in Taiwan. And we need to get him here and talk to him about it. Go down to the bottom, and it says, signed by William Morrell, Jr., and carbon copy to Ambassador David Kennedy. Who's David Kennedy? Right there. This man gets a carbon copy of this. Go up to the top of the page, would you, Corey? And over here on the right here, there's David Kennedy, Chairman of the Board of the U.S. ROK Economic Council. And those folks are writing a letter to Don Gregg saying, hey, we've got to improve things with ROK. Now, this is really irrelevant. I just put it up here to introduce Don Gregg to you. Don Gregg was a career CIA man who was the station chief in Seoul and worked in Burma before that. He worked in Japan. A career CIA man who, when George Bush Sr. became head of the CIA, he looks around for people that are sharp to work on his staff, and of all the people he could pick out of the CIA to be his aide, his national security advisor, he picks Don Gregg. So, as a career CIA guy, he's a bright guy. He gets picked up by the vice president as his man. And then when George Bush Sr. becomes president, who does he send off to Korea to become his ambassador to Korea? Don Gregg. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a guy who has genuine, conservative, Republican credentials. Now, if you all leave here, and some of my students think I'm a little bit liberal. Do you think I was liberal?
No,
Not then. The world has changed. This is the reddest of red states. Have you heard about that? And if I say anything at all critical of the Bush administration, I'm portrayed as a liberal by some of my students. But so I'm not going to speak from me today. I'm going to talk to you from the voice of Don Gregg, okay? And if you want to call Don Gregg a liberal, then everybody's liberal, okay? Ronald Reagan's a liberal. Everybody's liberal, okay? So the word liberal loses all its meaning if you're going to apply the word liberal to Don Gregg, okay? Let's go back to Google. And let's type in where you've got, go down to search in, or search within. Go back to the Don Gregg page, and let's go search within, and let's go to, there's Google. Well, while this is coming up, I called Don on the phone after that C-SPAN thing that I saw and sympathized with him. And I called him yesterday in preparation for this. And I said, I've been looking up all this stuff on the web that you've been saying because I want to coach on this. And I decided it's kind of funny to do all this stuff when I should talk to you directly. So I called him. Oh, it's good to talk to you. We know each other a bit. So go down to the bottom and search under Search Within. Search Within results. Yeah, right there. Right there. Go a little lower. There you go. And type in there Frontline. And Frontline, of course, is the TV program. And Don Gregg gave an interview on Frontline a while back. Now, we'll come back to this first one right here. That's actually a different Frontline. But let's go down. I think it's on the second or third page. A lot of this stuff is about Don Gregg. No, not that one. I'm sorry. Go back. Go down to the bottom and go to the next. Go next. Yeah. And go down. It keeps cutting off on us. There's Frontline on one of these things. I think it's actually on the next page. Go next. And I think it's on the top of this one. No. Yeah. Which one is it?
Second, right at the very top right now. See Frontline.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. This, is this it? No, that's named high school soccer coach. That's not it. Right there? No, that's not it. That's not it. Go down a bit more. Oh, there, a Demopedia. That strangely came up under that. Hit that one. Oh, excuse me, this isn't it. But let's look at this while we're at it. This is one that blasts Don Gregg for not supporting George W. Bush. I think that's what this one is. Yeah. Let's go back to Google and go to next. Maybe it's on the top of the next page. Oh, maybe it shifted around since I was there. Go back to the first page. We'll skip this one. There's a Don Gregg interview. Okay, now go search within and put Frontline on it again, and then go to the first one there. And we're going to have an interview by a guy by the name of Stephen Bosworth. Stephen Bosworth was ambassador to Korea 3 men after Don Gregg. And Bosworth was interviewed also on Frontline. Now the Frontline page, yeah, click on that first one. The Frontline website that interviews Don Gregg goes through an hour-long interview. You get the transcript on the web. It's easy to find. The format looks very much like this. And like Stephen Bosworth, here are 2 ambassadors in a row who have been given full hour-long interviews on Frontline. Look up in the, can you read the Korean? Look where your arrow is pointing, just to the left or right there. Can you read that Korean? Oh, don't click on it, just read it. You Korean speakers, what does that say? nuclear gamble, Hechtobach. And so that's what this whole thing is about. And here, Bosworth is talking about the agreed framework. And he says, it was put together in 94. Basically, from our point of view, it was a deal whereby the North Koreans froze their nuclear facilities, which we believe were nuclear weapons facilities, and agreed to eventually dismantle those. In return, they would receive energy compensation from the United States. And here he responds to this accusation that the agreed framework was basically extortion or bribery. And he says, and the thing over to the right here, it's extortion. And we're rewarding bad behavior, some people say. But much of diplomacy is rewarding bad behavior. That's what diplomacy is about. That's why you do diplomacy instead of war. When rewarding bad behavior doesn't work, then you go to war. So dealing with bad behavior is what diplomats are supposed to do. You're trying to figure out how you can stop the worst of the behavior at the lowest possible price. So here's another ambassador who's going along with the same idea that the agreed framework is a way to do it. Let's go to this chronology page here. Yeah. And go down through this. It's going to load up. There's a picture of the Yunbyon plant that became an issue in '89. Here's old Hans Blix. Remember him? Became more famous during the Iraq thing. He's out there inspecting from the IAEA. Let's see. Here's North Korea threatens to withdraw. North Korea raises the stakes. U.S. considers military response. You know, what Gordon said was really true about Clinton. You know, looking back on it now, you all think of Clinton as this liberal, soft Democrat. But we were that close to war with North Korea. And we forget about that. And this, as Gordon said, what we've seen in recent years is sort of a replay of what we saw in '93, '94. Bosworth here was the ambassador in Seoul at that point. And he said he was within 1 day of ordering the evacuation of civilians. I mean, that's how close we were to war with North Korea under Clinton. And so people who throw out the agreed framework as if it's no big thing, as if it's complete appeasement, have no idea of the stress and crisis that we were going through to get to that point, you see. So let's go down a little bit more. Considered military options. And then here it is that Gordon talked about. Carter shows up more or less out of the blue. It turns out he had a standing invitation from Kim Il-sung from some other context. And he decided to go ahead and take him up on this. And it was Carter's visit out of the blue that broke the back of the stalemate. Now, we're in a parallel situation right now. And we're as Gordon was saying, we've sort of put North Korea on the back burner. We're not really dealing with North Korea. We're not ready to go to war there. And I don't know if Jimmy Carter could go back to Pyongyang and deal with the son. He went back and dealt with the old man. Here he is talking with Kim Il-sung himself right there. And then Kim Il-sung dies shortly afterward. But you know, we're in a parallel situation. And I can't help but think that if George Bush Jr. really wanted to solve this problem, all he'd have to do is say, we're going to put forth our best efforts in negotiating this thing. And I'm going to ask former President Bush to go over and meet with Kim Jong-il. And if he were to do that, the prestige that Kim Jong-il would get out of it would be huge. And yet it would be a former president. It wouldn't be an official sitting president to go. It wouldn't be, you know, a Secretary of State or something. It would be an unofficial person. He's a citizen, right? He's nobody anymore. But he was a former president. Not only is he a former president, he's a former head of the CIA, former ambassador to China, someone who knows what East Asia is about. And I think if George W. Bush really wanted to solve this problem, the answer would be to do something parallel to what was done before. Send a former president over. And a president who's his father, who has the credentials that he has, I think it would break the iceberg, or break through the like an icebreaker breaking through the ice. It would open things up. That's just one idea. Well, Kim Il-sung dies. Let's go down a little bit more. And here's the agreed framework then that's negotiated and publicized. Let's go down a little bit more. North Korea downs a U.S. helicopter. This business about the helicopter, and there were a couple other firefights along the outside. Don Gregg has an interesting analysis of that, there was some degree of autonomy on the North Korean military, that they had certain provocations planned. Those have all been reined in. You don't see any provocations from North Korea to South Korea for the last, 6 or 8 years?
Year?
Yeah.
2 years at max, right?
No, there's been, it hasn't been like it was before. And, the things are more or less under control. And then the next thing you know, here's Kim Dae-jung announcing the Sunshine Policy and going off to visit Kim Jong-il in North Korea. And for this, he gets the Nobel Peace Prize. But right away, the detractors say, oh yeah, he paid a lot of money for this. And it's the only tainted Nobel Peace Prize in the history of the world. I mean, that's what the critics of Kim Jong-il are saying, or of Kim Dae-jung are saying. But it was real movement. I mean, years ago, to imagine Park Chung-hee going to Pyongyang, it never happened. But have a sitting president visit Pyongyang and then talk about having Kim Jong-il visit Seoul. It was a promised visit. It was all set up, but went south with largely through the sabotage of the Bush administration of the Sunshine Policy. Let's go down to the next phase. That's '98, and then you've got them launching missiles, and then you've got North Korea agrees to inspections of suspected nuclear site. Then Perry visits Pyongyang. This is the former Secretary of Defense, William Perry. Then go down a little bit more. What do we have? Here's Kim Jong-il. North-South tensions ease. And from this point forward, this is the key word for what's going on in North and South Korea. For years and years since the Korean War, the United States and the ROK have been in lockstep agreement on foreign policy, at least vis-a-vis North Korea. Things are broken now. We're no longer are South Korea and the United States in harmony. In fact, Gordon and I were talking about it before at lunch, and he was saying he's never seen the U.S.-ROK alliance in such disarray. It's hardly even an alliance anymore. And the two countries have gone on such divergent paths. South Korea is now looking forward to some kind of negotiated settlement and some kind of, if not unification, some steps toward unification and some sort of peaceful confederation or something, and that's all the talk in South Korea. In the meantime, what's the United States doing? Instead of talking peace, 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 the United States is talking war, war, war. I was in Korea in October of 2002 before the, it's 2004, before the Kerry-Bush election. And I was riding in a cab, and I always take the opportunity to interview cab drivers, because they're a great pulse of the country. They talk to people, they have their own ideas, they listen to the radio, they got nothing to do, they're driving around, they listen to all this stuff. And so I always like to interview the taxi drivers and see what's going on. What do you think of Kim Dae-jung? What do you think of No Moo-hyun? What do you think of Kim Jong-il, or Kim Young-sam? Whoever's president, I like to talk about that. When I was in Korea as a missionary, you don't talk politics. When you go back as a private citizen, you can talk politics to anybody you want to. It's really great. And so this one particular taxi driver, just before the Bush-Kerry election, at the height of the campaign in October, mid-October, just 2-3 weeks before the election, we're talking about politics, and we talk about Bush, we're talking about Kerry, and I said, well, who would you vote for if you were an American citizen? If you could vote, you vote for Bush or vote for Kerry? Kerry! In a heartbeat. Couldn't vote for Bush. And I said, oh, you don't like Bush? No. Nobody likes Bush over here. And I said, you're kidding. Nobody? He said, no, nobody likes Bush. And I said, okay, now just a second. Think of all the people that have ridden in your cab that have talked about American politics. Think of all your friends, all your relatives, all the other cab drivers. Out of all of those, you've got to think of somebody that likes Bush. Now tell me, think about it. He was quiet for a long time, and he thought you could just see him going through his Rolodex in his mind of all this. He said, nope, not one. And, you know, that may not be 100% true.
This was a cab driver in Washington?
Yeah. No, it was New York. It's not true of everybody in South Korea, of course. You can find somebody that likes Bush. But you got to look pretty hard to do it. Why? Because Bush is talking war. Rumsfeld said right at the outset of the Iraq War, so he asked a question about Korea, and he said, we can fight on two fronts if we need to. Our army is large enough, we can fight on two fronts. And in going through these Google sites, there are a couple of them that talk about preparing for invading or bombing North Korea. I mean, this is not a dream. The North Koreans are not imagining this. It was really discussed. And so suddenly George Bush in South Korea is seen as a symbol of war when everyone else in South Korea is talking about the road toward peace and eventual toward unification, which is a long-held dream of South Koreans. And why are they so upset about Bush? If the thing does turn into a war, is it Washington, D.C. that's turned into a sea of fire? Is it the White House that gets burned? I mean, this guy's playing in somebody else's backyard. And he's playing with fire in somebody else's backyard. And so a lot of the South Koreans don't appreciate it. And it shows up in opinion surveys. If you do a general survey, not just students, a general survey of public opinion in South Korea, which nation is the greatest danger to South Korea right now? And for years and years and years, it was a no-brainer. The greatest danger to South Korea right now is North Korea. But now, you know what the answer is? The greatest danger to South Korea is
Japan.
the United States of America.
It was the U.S. for the last 2 years, but Japan took over.
Is Japan taken over? Okay. Okay, we're live here for a while, and then we get to the axis of evil speech, which really threw cold water not only on North Korea, which sort of expected it, but on South Korea as well. This is the epitome of playing with fire in somebody else's backyard. I think, is this the same State of the Union where there's the 16 words, the yellow cake, or was that the next State of the Union? I clicked on this one and couldn't find the yellow cake in this. I think the yellow cake is in the next.
2003.
Is in the next one. This is 2002. Yeah. Okay. So the North Koreans respond that that statement is nothing short of declaring war. Then we get Pyongyang admitting that secret uranium enrichment program, and again, it's sort of a provocation. There was a website in here that talks about what Gordon was talking about, where the North Korean objective is just to get some recognition, just to be closer to the front burner. Go on quickly down to the bottom. I think that's pretty well everything else on there. Yeah, that's pretty well it on that. So that's a synopsis of this. There are some other pages on here that are really interesting about Don Gregg, and there's also a page that's easy to find about Don Oberdorfer. It turns out Don Gregg and Don Oberdorfer have gone to Pyongyang together to try to do something on their own. Don Gregg now, former ambassador, is now the chairman of the Korea Society in New York City. The Korea Society exists to encourage goodwill and good education about Korea within the United States. They sponsor a lot of seminars. Whenever the president visits Washington, he visits New York, and they have a nice dinner sponsored by the Korea Society. He's doing that kind of work. And much to his credit, and exactly to the wording of what Ramona said in her prayer, that we may do some good in the world and make a difference. That's exactly what Donald Gregg is trying to do. So on his own, using his position as the chairman of the Korea Society as the launch pad, he has made trips to North Korea. The Frontline site that I couldn't find for you, it's there. It's easy to find. I don't know where you're going to find it, but it's there. It was made right after his first trip to Korea in 2002. I asked Don yesterday when I called him how many trips he's made to Korea. He's made 4 trips to Korea. And his assistant, the president of the Korea Society, he's the chair of the president of the society, he's an old friend of mine. One reason that I like Don Gregg is we share good taste. I hired a guy by the name of Fred Carrier when I was the Fulbright director, and Don Gregg hired Fred Carrier to be the chair of the president of the association. We both hired the same guy. And actually Don hired Fred Carrier on my recommendation. And Fred's been a wonderful president of the Korea Society, and Fred has been to North Korea several more times. And under the initiative of the Korea Society, Kim Chek University in, I think it's in Pyongyang, in North Korea, now has a sister school arrangement with Syracuse University in upstate New York. And through this sister school relationships, they are doing a lot of technology transfers of internet technology. And North Korea, like South Korea, wants to be known as an internet active society. Now, how in the world is North Korea going to protect its citizens from the world once the internet comes in? And if we had a harmonious situation out there, you know, there's going to always be a little bit of tension. They'll be yelling at each other, and the things might not work completely all the time. But if we had the agreed framework or something like it operating, and we have Kim Jong-il visiting Seoul the way it was planned to go, and Roh Moo-hyun can visit Pyongyang, and we have exchange of families. Over the years, there have been, I looked this up once or twice a year for the last 10 years or so, there have been family reunions of North and South families that have reunited. If there was more and more of that, we have now South Korean visitors can go to Kumgangsan, the famous mountain resort, the Diamond Mountains, and visit and tour around just in that area. These things weren't possible 10 or 15 years ago, but now there's a potential for a great many more of these sorts of things. They're proceeding with the Kaesong Industrial Complex, which will be a north-south joint venture project of some kind. And I just read in the news just yesterday or the day before that one of the automobile manufacturers is building a huge plant 3 miles south of the DMZ. Now, if that, I can't remember if it was Hyundai or who it was, but they're building this huge plant. If they were building this huge plant south of the DMZ, anticipating a war and having the whole thing destroyed, these people have to have their heads examined. That's not what they're planning. They're planning on a peaceful arrangement of some kind and have it close to the DMZ. Maybe they can get workers to come and work on a guest pass situation of some kind of thing. See, there are all sorts of potential available if we're heading down the road to peace. But what's happened so far is we've pulled back from the road to peace, and we've got this axis of evil out there operating, and that North Korea cannot be trusted, and all of this sort of thing. I think that in the long range, the history of the axis of evil statement may go down in history as one of the biggest failures of a foreign policy initiative. The axis of evil probably means that we want to keep. Well, first of all, we're going to take over Iraq and change it somehow. Is that going to work? I don't know. And Iran, we're going to keep Iran and keep North Korea from becoming nuclear powers. Is that going to happen? I don't think so. We are 6 years closer to a nuclear-powered North Korea today than we were the day George W. Bush was elected. Is that success or is that failure? I mean, that's a pretty big a failure as you can find. In the world of diplomacy. And I fear that the axis of evil, and when I was talking to Don Gregg about this, he says, it's just so frustrating. He says, what's Hill's first name? Christopher Hill. He says, I admire him. He's a great negotiator. He's got a great sense of humor. He's a great guy. He can do a lot, but he's pulled back by Rice, who's pulled back by Bush. Don Gregg talked with the North Korean official about the forgery incident, one of the big deals that the Americans are all head up about. And the guy that was here from the State Department a month ago was talking about, we've closed down, through American pressure, we've closed down a bank in Macau. The bank was a front organization for forgeries coming out of North Korea. Well, Ambassador Gregg talked to a North Korean official about these forgeries. And the guy said, look, you're strangling us. We have no way of banking in an international context. When you, the North Korean speaking to Don Gregg, when you come to North Korea, you can't do any banking. You have to bring all your cash with you because we have no standing in the international community. Why can't we retaliate and forge documents? I mean, the guy's admitting it. I mean, for a long time we've accused North Korea of official state forgery of $100 bills. Well, he was admitting it. And he said, but we would change if we could bank in a legitimate way. And that's Don Gregg's message, that we can change. And he talks about, in the news recently, Richard Armitage, who's one of the high State Department officials, who's tried to come out with a more humane approach to North Korea. He's admitted in the press just recently that he's been reined in by Cheney and Bush. And so you have Republicans within the party who are, within the administration, who are trying to make something work, but the hardliners are keeping it all from happening. And when the history of this period is written, as far as North Korea is concerned, and as far as South Korea is concerned, as far as both Koreas are concerned, the axis of evil may not be Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. It might be the White House, the Pentagon, and the State Department. So the secret, I was going to put up one other page, but the bottom line of what all these guys are saying is, we've got to talk. And the White House is refusing to talk. And if we could talk, if we just come to the table with some decent proposals, I think we could be on the way to peace again. And you just have to realize you're dealing with some tough negotiators who start negotiating after the contract is signed. That's enough.